And then, hello, everybody. Okay, so hi, welcome. For anybody who doesn't know who I am, and I think everybody does, but I'll say it anyway since it's being recorded. My name is Erica, and I'm the Research Development Lead here in the Office of Sponsored Programs. And I also will take a second to introduce Kara and Ruby, who are my two tech support wizards, and they're also available. They also are the people that help faculty, staff, and lecturers search for funding opportunities. So if anybody at the end of this or anyone who watches this is interested in finding funding, please contact Kara and Ruby. And before I introduce Katja, I'm also going to drop into the chat. This is a list of our sponsored programs, internal funding opportunities. So since I've got a captive audience, I'll let you know about that. Right now, already available is our RSCA Research and Scholarly Activities. There's something missing. Competition, which is $5,000, and it's currently available. I think the competition ends later this month. So if you're interested in that, you can find access to that on our email or on our webpage, or you can email me about it as well. And then we also have, we'll soon be releasing their incentives program, which is pays for faculty and research lecturers with research associate status can get release time to write a grant or summer salary. And that will be due in January. Later this fall, we'll be releasing our equity opportunity that will be available sometime in the spring. That is on the list though. And we're also going to launch a sustainability grant with the Office of Sustainability. I'm hoping that one will be out next week. So that's a brand new one. We're just making it up as we go. And I think that will also be due probably at the end of October. So keep your eyes peeled for that. I expect that to go out next week. And one other thing is that Ruby and I are working on a speed networking event October 6th. So we're still working on the logistics of that because we've never done it before, but we're really excited. So keep your eyes peeled for that because I expect that to go out early or mid next week as well. Okay, so that I'm done with all that. Now I'll introduce Katja because she's the reason everyone's here. And so Katja, if you don't know, I think probably everybody does, but I'm going to introduce her anyway. She's the associate professor and the department chair of Native American Studies here at Cal Poly Humboldt. She's the co-director of the Native American Studies Food Sovereignty Lab and Cultural Workshop Space. She has a book out titled We Are Dancing for You, Native Feminisms and the Revitalization of Women's Coming of Age Ceremonies, which received an award for Best First Book in Native American and Indigenous Studies at the 2019 Native American Indigenous Studies Association Conference. On top of all of that, she's also the volunteer executive director of the Native Women's Collective, a nonprofit organization that supports the continued revitalization of Native American arts and culture. And she's Hupa, Karuk, and Yurok, and is enrolled in the Hupa Valley tribe. And I've had the pleasure to work with Katja over the years in my previous capacity as a pre-award specialist. And I'll just say I've always really enjoyed working with her. I'm super excited that she's here speaking with you today. The breadth of the topics and the creativity of her proposals has always made my job very interesting. She's also very forgiving of tech issues. So extra kudos to have her here today on our first launch of our discussions. But overall, I think watching the way that Katja has brought grant searches, grant writing, and involvement in grants generally into her courses in a way that gave her students a real sense of doing something with real meaning and impact has been really exciting. And being able to talk to the students who are really excited and proud of the work that they've done and the experiences that they've gained actually almost made me want to go back to school and become a student again. So I don't think you could say it's less work mentoring students, but in some ways I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that this approach has the potential to really expand one's bandwidth and capacity to take on more projects. So I'm again super excited that Katja's here to share her experience and resources with us today. And I'll stop talking and hand it over.
Thank you, Erica. Hey, Kile. I'm Katja Risling Baldy. I'm the Department Chair of Native American Studies. Joining you today from Gootdini, or Among the Redwoods, in my office here at Cal Poly Humboldt. and happy that people joined, and also hopefully it'll get a second sort of life being recorded and posted in various places. I will say that for those of you who are here today, I'm going to share with you the actual resources. You get to have them and take them with you. And then if you're not, you just get to see them on screen. So screenshot or something. You should have come. But otherwise, it'll just sort of be like a helpful overview. So what I put into the chat for people is an upcoming course that I'm going to talk about with grant writing. So it shows you sort of the syllabus as it stands right now. It might change a little bit depending on who teaches it, but this is sort of the course that I proposed. And then also I put in for you the prompts that I use to sort of build grant writing projects and projects into the courses that I teach. This specifically takes you through 3 years of my class called Indigenous Natural Resource Management Practices, which used to be offered in the fall and only once a year. Starting this year, we're actually going to start offering it every semester because it's such a popular and requested course. I think in part because we do things like this. We make it like a project-based course where they're doing projects that really they can give back to the community, but also that they can see come into being and into fruition. I will say a lot of times people ask me like, how did you learn to write grants, or where did you learn to write grants, or why do you think so much about grants? The truth is I was a grant writer before I went back to graduate school. And my parents actually were both people who wrote grants for tribes and worked a lot on grant writing. So I just kind of grew up around them grant writing. But there was when I got back home from college and after I got my master's degree, my mom was like, you need like a job. And I was thinking of what I could possibly do. And she said, why don't you go write some grants? And I was like, well, I've never really written a grant before. And she said, the best way to learn to write grants is just to start writing grants and then just figure it out as you go along. And so I took some grant writing trainings, a lot of like free ones that were online, but then I actually signed up for like a week-long grant writing training and then like another 2-week-long one, and spent a lot of time learning the lingo of how to talk about grants and like what grants were talking about, because that was sort of where I didn't understand, like I didn't understand a lot of their lingo. Once I learned that, a lot of it was just kind of trial and error, figuring out what worked and what didn't, and writing a lot of grants that didn't get funded, or a lot of grants that maybe would get funded. And then we'd look back and be like, I don't know why that got funded, but I guess we just got lucky. And figuring out kind of what worked for us process-wise. I have written probably every kind of grant you could think of because I worked as a grant writing consultant. And so I would go in and write grants for people. So I've written federal grants, state grants, foundation grants, private grants, short like 1-page letter grants, all the way to like, 100 and something page sort of like federal and academic kind of grants. For a long time, I was a person who trained people on how to write federal grants. I felt like federal grants were like the most intimidating to people. And so the idea was, how do we kind of break down what it really means to access and operate and write federal grants? I will often tell people, if you're going to start grant writing, like what I did when I started grant writing was I started with a federal grant that was really difficult to write. And either that will make the decision as to whether you're going to write grants or not, because you sort of are like, am I actually going to put up with this for the rest of my life? But I will say that like the writing part was never really that hard for me. The part that was difficult was being able to like take the time to work through all the different necessary sort of requirements that are very different between agencies, and just feeling like needing help to navigate like, oh, this is actually something you have to think about because this is a different agency. It's why I really like what sponsored programs helps you to do at Cal Poly Humboldt, because instead of just being me all by myself going, oops, I missed this whole section of the grant, I have somebody who's like, hey, you missed this whole section of the grant. We got to work on this part. And it's very, very helpful. So I will say, like, we're very, very lucky at Cal Poly Humboldt to have the office, but also the people who are really very like understanding, and they try very hard to sort of help you through the process. A lot of when you're a grant writing consultant, they can't help you through the process. It's like you kind of all by yourself. I would say there's 2 like really difficult grants I wrote before I kind of came back to be a professor. I wrote one for the EPA for an EPA grant. And then I also wrote one for the Department of Education. Both of those are their own animals for different reasons. And then both of those actually did end up getting funded. And those were, I think, two that I'd be like, that's, you know, because a lot of it happened very last minute. I will tell you that like, I'm learning consistently how to be less last minute about grant writing. And I think that bringing it to my students helped me to kind of, for them to be able to set up deadlines, expectations. They were just like, we're going to break it down into parts. And so we were getting things done consistently. So what I'm going to tell you basically is like a story of how this sort of started with students and where it's at right now in terms of introducing them to grant writing. The story ends with a fully funded food sovereignty lab that is now going to be remodeled, but it begins with a discussion between me and a group of students in my class about, well, what do we want to do now? Like, what's something we want to do? So I'm going to share my screen really quick. Let's see. So the first thing I wanted to say is that starting next semester, NAS is actually going to be offering a grant writing course. And this came out of the work that we've been doing with students to have grant writing as a part of the curriculum that we're doing in our classes. Many of them are very interested in how they can continue to actually write grants that they can submit or that we can sort of like make a part of our program. So we developed a grant writing course that will be offered starting in the spring. It's NAS 312, which is called Grant Writing for Social and Environmental Justice. And many of the, some of the signature assignments that are in this grant writing course came out of the way that we developed assignments in the classes that I've been doing grant writing in. It really is going to teach about the mechanics of proposal writing, but also kind of the political social aspects of grantsmanship, skills, the different types of grants that there are. And then it's really going to think about like, what do we think about the nonprofit industrial complex? What do we think about who gets funded and who doesn't? What do we think about like how we kind of start to have bigger conversations about how we help people to know what we do? Because a lot of the times when foundations will come to visit the area, now I'm in the spaces where they want to like talk to me, and it's sort of learning how to tell them, let's think about the priorities of who you have funded and why, and then how do we get funding into communities that might not necessarily have access? And then how do we help people to do grant writing who might not necessarily be people that think of themselves as grant writers? And then really to kind of think about what it means to translate community like visions and dreams into like a grant writing project. And I think it's going to kind of really think about the social justice aspect of grant writing, because when you do the research and you look into it, you kind of come to find out like nationally, foundations tend to give less to like Native communities and Native peoples and organizations than any other group of people, that they don't really invest in like what we're doing. And a lot of times they don't really hear about what we're doing. So we think about like, how do we help to, like, what does it mean to be in that process and how can we push back against that process? So we really talk about that in terms of the grant writing process. I did put the draft syllabus if people want to look at some of the resources that are going to be presented to students. If you're thinking about bringing resources into your own classroom, there's some really good ones on there. If you're like, oh, that would be like a really good YouTube video to show them, or a really good article for them to read about grant writing, about creating objectives, about why you do this, about like how you help the community to find the words to say what they do every day, right? All of those things are already in the syllabus. So we start here. So the Rote de la Guerre Food Sovereignty Lab and Traditional Ecological Knowledges Institute is going to be a space of research and collaboration between tribal communities and the Native American Studies Department and Cal Poly Humboldt to be able to bring to fruition a lot of programs and projects that help to integrate traditional ecological knowledge for food sovereignty, food justice, and then the aspects of what we do around land management and land management practices. It's now coming to being, like we're going to be opening it in January or February. It's going to be like a fully functioning space. We've been able to do so much over the past few years, but the project really began in my NAS 331 Indigenous Natural Resource Management Practices course. And so what happened that year is that I came into the class and I said, normally we do like a final project, and I would divide you into groups and we would do a final project. in your group and you would turn it in and then I would grade it and that would be the end of it. But what if this semester we tried to come up with something that we thought could be left behind after we were done? If we tried to come up with a way that we wanted to kind of contribute to indigenizing this campus. And to their credit, after all that we were talking about with the way that we do research, they had said, well, we can't make that decision on our own. We actually need to talk to tribal community members. We need to talk to the people like the Native faculty and staff on this campus. We need to talk to tribal leaders and figure out what they think should happen at Cal Poly Humboldt. So for the whole semester, we focused on creating a project that would answer that question of what should we do to indigenize this campus. And I put the prompt that I initially used, it's in the chat if you download one of the PDFs. It's actually like the very first prompt, and what you see is it's a two-part prompt. The first was, we're going to spend some time in class talking about what you want to do, and then I'm going to develop the next steps of how we can put that together. But I'm not telling you what your final project is. We have to actually talk about it first. Then we develop the final project, and then we take time in class to break it down into what do we need to make this project happen. So what happened with the lab specifically was that, and here I'll share this section for you really quick, is that we ended up breaking it down into several different aspects of what needs to happen to complete the project. And so we had set that really they needed to present to the Council of American Indian Faculty and Staff. They would be completing like a report about what their outcomes were so that the Council of American Indian Faculty and Staff could give feedback, and that would help us decide how we were going to move forward. So we first set a date for when we would meet with them, and we were like, okay, we can reasonably get on the agenda for CAFES for November 13th, 2019. And then we set what needs to get done by that date so that we can present something to CASE and they can decide which project we're going to move forward with. And so I had given them multiple projects that they could pick from. You'll see I had said we could do a class podcast, we could do a grant writing project, we could do a gathering, a conference, or a meeting. And I was like, here's all these things that we could do. And it was, again, the class that said, actually, we can't make that decision. We need them to tell us what we should do. So we picked a date for the meeting, and then we picked exactly what each of the groups were going to do to contribute to a report that we would give to CAFE so that they could help give feedback on what project we were going to do. And so each group took on different things. We had like an interview group that interviewed different faculty, staff, and tribal leaders about their feelings about how to indigenize the campus. A research group that did findings of what has already been done on other campuses and like what are some ways that they have approached indigenizing the campus. We had a map group who made a map of HSU and every sort of indigenous aspect of anything that exists. And then we had a grants group that talked about a chart of ways they thought that they could fund different types of projects. And then we had the report on findings group, and they were going to take all of these things that were gathered and put together a report that we would then give to CAFES and say, this was our findings of what people had said to us, but what do you think that we should do? So that all happened within like September, October, so that by November, we were ready to talk to the Council of American Indian Faculty and Staff. What then happened after that is that what became very obvious from the charts and the report, and that report we still have, it's actually like a 20-something page document that the students put together, very professional. And what happened is from the coding of the interviews, and so they brought the interviews back to us. They did an initial coding, and then the class got to give feedback on the coding and say, well, we actually feel like this was said here. We learned about how to do that process. From the coding of the interviews, they said what came to the top was a food sovereignty lab. And actually multiple of their interviews had mentioned like some type of lab, some type of food sovereignty lab, some type of space for traditional ecological knowledge. And they had coded those all together, and they said that's what came to the top. And the Council of American Indian Faculty and Staff looked at it and said, that sounds like a great idea. What does that look like? So then we kept going. So after CAFES was like, that sounds like a great idea, we just kept going, and we were like, what's next? What do we got to do next? So we divided into further groups about what are the next processes that we have to do to complete this project. And that became a matter of determining like a budget, of what we would need to make the project happen. And then it also became a discussion around like, well, what does it look like and where could it be housed? And then what happened is in the midst of it, there was a call on campus for open spaces and people could apply for them. So I brought that to the class and I said, hey, there's a call for open space. And one of the spaces is the BSS store, which is located really near the Goudini Gallery and the Native American Forum and where Native American Studies is. And our class was actually in the BSS. So we went down that day and we looked at it. We like peeked in all the windows and everything. And I said, well, what we should do is apply for this space, because if we can get the space, we can start planning around what we're going to do. So then the assignment became, we need to fill out the space application. So the students did the work to look up all the information we needed, figure out all the different sections. They would like send in their answers to the different questions. And then a couple of the students took on making sure that it was all filled out correctly. And then I reviewed it, edited, and then turned it in. And that was sort of like, okay, we did that part of it. Then the other thing that we decided to do was a listening session, like a community listening session, because now that we knew that we were developing a food sovereignty lab, we wanted the community to be able to give us insight into what does that even mean? What does that even look like? So the students worked to organize a large community listening session. There was over like 80 attendees over the course of the listening session. The first part of the listening session, they made a decision that they were going to set it aside for Indigenous peoples only. And then the second part was community-wide. They led that listening session over like a 4-hour time period. They recorded it. They recorded all the answers. They had specific questions. People gave all their feedback. They provided food, like they did all the things. Then after that, they took all those results. Then we divided the class up again into groups, and each of them took a different aspect of what they wanted to report on so that we could write a final sort of plan of what the lab could look like and how it should function according to the community. So all of that happened in one semester, but a lot of it was just like consistent coming back and being like, okay, now what do we need to do? I would spend at least, like we would always take the first 15 to 20 minutes of the class to check in on what was going on with the project. And then every like 2 or 3 weeks, I would have the whole class dedicated to talking about the project. And so it was like check in consistently, and then at least 2 or 3 weeks, a whole class check in where we would just sit there and talk about the project and work on things that we needed to get done. And then by the end of the semester, we had a plan for what the lab could look like. Very preliminary. I will say it's always in motion and changing, but at least we had documents that we could pull from. And we were waiting to hear back about our space request. So I will say that it happened very organically. What it took on my part as the faculty was a lot of like organizational structure around coming back in and saying, now this is the part we have to do. I told them that I wanted them to treat me like a project manager and to really consider that like if they were at a job and they were working on a project and we were checking in like once a week, what would your project manager expect from you? And what would they want to hear about? And like, what are the questions that we would ask each other to make sure that we're on top of things? And they really, really did a great job, like taking very seriously that they were like reporting to their project manager. Their groups would get together and then come in and be like, this is what we've accomplished. And I think that it was really helpful for them to think about it. It's like a training exercise for when they have a job or they're working in community, that they needed to take it like seriously. And it really helped them. Now, ever since then, because after a lot of work, we were able to secure the space. And then after that, it became a matter of, well, now we have to see if we can actually make it happen, because we have a plan, we have the space, and we needed to do fundraising, and we needed to do grant writing, and we needed to bring in money to make this lab happen. And so a lot of what was created by the students in the class after that became about aspects of what could help to build the lab, and whether that be fundraising or plans or outreach or budgeting, or even like physically showing up to meetings to talk to people about things or requests. So a lot of what I'm going to show you now are actually things that were created by the students in the class. So these were actual assignments. So you'll see that by like the third year of us working on this, the third fall, there's a lot of like different projects that are suggested, and they get to pick and they go, oh, I can do that, I can do that. And a lot of it was about building things that we would need to be able to get funding for the lab, or to really focus in on grant writing. So here, I'll show you. So this is a short video that was created by a student to talk about the lab. When we were looking at visiting with different foundations, we had written letters to, so one of the assignments that they had been given was to be able to write a one-page letter about the lab that fully explains what it is, how much money we would need to make it happen, and why it's important. Each of them practiced writing these one-page letters. Then they submitted them, and then everybody picked the ones that they thought were like the ones that just really did a great job, and said, these are the ones we're going to use. Then we started to then reach out to some foundations that we knew, and one of them was like, well, we want to know more about the lab, but we needed to find some way to help people to get invested. And one of the students said, I'll make a video. So here's like the very short video that they made. I have to make sure, hold on, I have to make sure I'm sharing my sound really quick. Oh yeah, I am, okay. Oops. What did I share? We don't know, hold on, okay.
We are on the land of the Wiyot peoples, which includes the Wiyot tribe, Bear River Rancheria, and Blue Lake Rancheria. Arcata, California is known as Gudini, meaning over in the woods. The Humboldt State University Food Sovereignty Lab and Cultural Workspace is a project championed by students. This lab was designed and proposed by students who wanted to implement a long-lasting, meaningful project that would support students attending Humboldt State, the Native American Studies program, and the surrounding tribal communities. Within the first year of this project, we have received wide support from the community and have secured our first grant award from the Humboldt Energy Independence Fund. Now, we are crowdfunding to raise $25,000 for the equipment that will support research on food sovereignty, support the resurgence of indigenous food sovereignty for local regional tribes, and build better futures for our planet. Located in the Behavioral and Social Sciences building, the Food Sovereignty Lab will sit adjacent to the Native American Forum and Gudini Gallery. The lab will include a commercially certified kitchen, large work tables, office space for research and studying, a whiteboard, a large television for use in presentations, and a sound system. This space will be able to support basket weaving, food preparation, and regalia making. Aside from designing the inside of the lab space, the project is envisioning how the landscape around the Food Sovereignty Lab and Native American Forum can be used to sustainably grow food, basketry materials, and medicine to supplement community projects and course curriculum. Once this project is completed, Humboldt State will become the first university in California with a space dedicated to the research, practice, and preservation of food sovereignty. We envision opportunities to bring in visiting researchers, postdocs, community leaders, and indigenous scientists and cultural artists to work closely with students, faculty, and staff. We see this as an amazing opportunity for Humboldt State to showcase their students and to build national and international connections that can reinvigorate our campus. From the students that have been a part of this project from the beginning, we are inviting you to support this work and donate today. We are on the land of the Wiyot peoples.
So I think what's important is that they started to think about like, how are we going to create these resources? Some of the things that were mentioned in that video, like the Humboldt Energy Independence Fund grant, that's one of the grants that one of the student groups did in that second year. So if you look at the group of assignments I gave you, the second year of assignments, they had to pick a grant that they were actually going to write and apply for. And one of the groups picked the Humboldt Energy Independence Fund grant. And they went through and actually like filled in all of the information. They would spend time in class doing it. And then they applied for it. And then we got that grant. So that was all very much part of like the project that they were doing. They also would spend time, like they would sometimes pick very large grants as part of their groups. And so I would break those grants down and I would say, okay, what can we reasonably get done in this period of time? Because really large grants can be overwhelming. So one of them would say, well, look, they need a logic model. I'll make the logic model. And they would go out and like watch all these YouTube videos on how to make a logic model. They would read about it. They would make one. I would give feedback. And then another one would say, okay, they want a goals and objectives table. I'll focus on that with this person. So they would break them down. They may not finish the entire grant, but I found that just having them do those parts would mean that I felt like it was easier to complete the bigger, like all the rest of the grant, because I had some of these parts down. At one point, students started asking me like, well, which parts of the grant do you not like to do? Like, what are the parts that like are the, because I was telling them, I always save the budget and the budget justification till last because I don't like to do it. And I'll always save the logic model until last because I don't like to do it. And so they were like, let's try to do the part she doesn't like to do. So that we could learn how to like help to support the grant writing process. And then they would oftentimes, because they would turn things in and then I'd review them and I'd give a lot of feedback. And we also, in our grant writing like modules, which I'll show you, we have a peer review day. And so they would have a time to hear from people about like what their grant narrative was helping people to understand or not understand. They were really, really good about like taking that feedback and then rewriting. And we kept talking about writing being revision and not coming out perfect every time that you write it, and that we were going to spend time on the revision process. And so they got really sort of excited that they were able to like revise and make it better. And then when I would tell them I am submitting this grant, they would also get very, very excited because I kept saying, if it gets funded, you get to say that you helped write a funded grant proposal. Like you can say that on your resume. You can say that when you go apply for jobs. You can be like, I wrote a grant that got funded for this much money. So they were really excited about that part of it too. Another student created, so when we did the opening for the lab, we had the groundbreaking. We haven't opened it officially, we had the groundbreaking. Another student group's project was that they were going to document the opening and the groundbreaking, and then they were going to make something like a video to document this groundbreaking, to talk about the importance of the lab. So this is another student video that was done as part of the class, but what they were hoping it would do was to give more attention to the project so that if we needed to use it for fundraising purposes, outreach to foundations, and also we needed to create like a presence because we were putting our website as a place that people could learn more about us if we were reaching out through shorter grant applications. We wanted to make sure that they could get as much information as possible. So this very short video was also created by a student group in the class.
We were in Dr. Risling Baldy's Native American Studies course 331, and Katja inspired us to come up with a group project that would have lasting benefits for the community.
We really went around and asked Native students, faculty, and staff, like, what do you need from like your university in order to be a successful Native Indigenous student?
This will be the first food sovereignty lab in the entire CSU system. I don't think there is any sort of institute that is really oriented around Indigenous food sovereignty, Indigenous food knowledges.
This project with my team is, I think inspiring is not a big enough word for it.
This lab is really possible because of our community.
Access to traditional foods also means things like bringing down the dams, returning fire to the forest, and returning land to Indigenous peoples. And so Indigenous food sovereignty really encompasses all of that.
So just to remind people, like the timeline of what we're talking about, we're looking at like December 2019 to right now, which is like spring of 2023. A lot of what the development happened in that first semester and continued until we got the approval, which was May of 2020. And then we started to do many more projects and funding around what we would like to see happen in the lab after that. Now, this timeline was also made by students, by the way. So students also will make these sorts of things for you if you want them to. I was like, what we need is a timeline of how we all made this come to be. And then they came up with this really beautiful timeline. Finally, what I'll say is I wanted to show you the sort of way that we worked in a grant writing workshop into the course specifically. So now each semester we would offer like a grant writing workshop as 2 days of the syllabus in the course, actually 2 modules. So it was like 2 weeks. Each module is 2 days. And so, because we do like a Monday, Wednesday, right? Or Tuesday, Thursday. So the way that it would work is module 1 would be introduction to grant writing. Module 2 would be resources. And then the final assignment is they do both a draft of the grant and a peer review, and then a final draft or the grant project items that they've agreed to make as part of what becomes like a draft of a grant. So if they pick a much larger grant, they would get pieces of it that they have to complete. If they picked a smaller grant, they're trying to complete the entire grant as a draft by the end of the semester. Module 1 looks kind of like this. So we really focus in module 1 on grant writing key terms, because many of the times, again, remember, like I said, when I learned to become a grant writer, I was really like, how do I talk about bringing a grant? Like, how do I talk about a grant? I don't really understand what they're saying. So it was to kind of really demystify how you understand what a grant is, what it's for, how it works. We have them prior to class. So we're doing a flipped classroom. They would watch short videos and do readings. They also have to complete a discussion post on Canvas where they're actually reflecting on what they learned from each resource. So I always have them boil it down to like the most important thing I learned from Grant Writing for Dummies, the most important thing I learned from the 10 common elements of a grant proposal, and why. And they have to post that before class so that when we're in class, we're actually working and not necessarily going over the readings. So it's sort of to help them to get ready to actually do the work on grants. And day 2, they're watching short videos around culturally responsive Indigenous evaluation, tribal governments, working in relationship with community. That helps them to kind of get grounded in what it means to develop a project and what we think about. In class for those 2 days, we're doing 3 primary activities. The first is we discuss key terms. So what I tend to have them do is create a key terms list as a class. So they will each as groups, they will go up and they'll have like either board, like an area of a chalkboard or a whiteboard or a piece of paper. And they're actually writing down what they think are the 10 key terms that they learned from this, from their first view of the module. And they have to create what we call their own sort of definition. So nothing that's like repeating the words of what they already heard. They have to put into their own words the definition of something that has to do with a grant. And they as a group decide their 10 key terms. And then we work as a class to determine like which key terms do we all want to like remember and keep in mind. They present to each other and then they help to like create tips. So the key terms help them then to create the classroom grant writing tips project. So they go from, we all did key terms to now we have to do 10 grant writing tips for our class. Like what are the 10 that we think we have to keep in mind as we're doing grant writing? And they have, I mean, every class is a little bit different in what they focus on. So they'll sort of be like, always read the RFP fully all the way through in case there's something in there that disqualifies you. Like they all internalize something like that, right? And they'll write their 10, they'll decide as a class, what are our 10 tips? That becomes what is posted in Canvas so that they can remind themselves as they're putting their grants together, these are the things I should keep in mind. And then what we do is spend some time on day 2, looking for grants and doing overviews of RFPs and what we think we need to take a look at. So I'll show them a federal RFP, I'll show them a foundation RFP, and I'll do this to kind of help them introduce to it. Then they pick their grant, and that helps them to prep for the next week's module. So in the second module, what happens, this is resources and templates. The template that I tend to have them look at and use, and you can find your own template, but the one I have used multiple times is Dr. Karen's Foolproof Grant Template, which is publicly available and you can download it. And it's very geared toward like an academic style of writing, but it also helps to demonstrate. You got to have a clear idea and you've got to like put it into these sections. It's, again, she says foolproof. So the idea of like, how do you put it together? So we go over that template in like the sections. Then we also spend time going through each group's RFP to sort of see what they're really focused on and if they think it's a good idea. They're supposed to have reviewed the RFP before they get back to class on that next day one to decide if it fits or if there's something that might say, oh, we don't actually qualify for this. In class, we'll also review a successful application that happens on the day 2 of the second week. The one that I tend to have them review is this one called Abolitionist Movements Involvement in American Politics that comes from the NEH. It's kind of like, to me, speaking to a lot of what we're trying to do in class. It demonstrates some really good ways of using language. So I was like, let's review this. So we actually review that in class. I don't assign that as pre-reading. Sometimes the students will, I will put it on Canvas. Sometimes the students will read ahead, but I come into class and I'm like, let's look at this as if we were grant reviewers. Let's think about like what it's telling us, what stands out. Let's think about what makes it good. And each of them will take time to reflect with their groups. They'll read certain sections of it, give feedback. They also have reviewed grant writing tips and grant writing for schools writing goals and objectives. And their job is to come in with an abstract of their grant proposal, which they have to have posted in their discussion so that we can start to think about what are people doing in their grant writing projects. We'll also, if we have time in class, work on starting to put together things into a grant skeleton. I'll teach them how to make a grant skeleton. I'll say, take this section, put it here so you know exactly what you need to write for your grants. And then they will have an opportunity to start thinking about the sections that they need to put together. And hopefully by the end of that class, we've assigned them like, you have one section or you have multiple sections or everybody's working on this same grant application because it's shorter. The assignments that they do really depended on what was going on in the class and what they were like deciding. So the first year was project development. The second year was really just grant writing. That's how we got the HIFE grant, because it was like, we're going to pick grants and we're going to write them. And then the third year became special projects that were lab related. And there were some students who worked on grants, and there were some students who worked on like these video projects and outcomes and trying to find ways to do policy and engage with the campus. So it really sort of depended on what was happening at the time. Now, the last thing I'll say is, as a result of the students doing work in the second year too, we worked on a grant that was for the Native American Agricultural Fund. And we had actually tried for this grant the first year that we were doing this. So the students had worked on the Native American Agricultural Fund grant in the first year, and I turned it in and it didn't get funded. So we went back to it the second year, and it was really powerful because I shared with them like, look, the first year attempt did not get funded, but sometimes you don't get funded. And then you have a grant you can pull from for the next year. So let's do it again and let's try again. And then they were like, how many times can you try? And I said, you can try as many times as you want. Like you can apply as many, like every year you can come back and be like, you said no last year, but you're gonna say yes this year. And I was like, the thing that we have for this one that we didn't have at first was they gave us feedback. And so we got to talk about like feedback to the grant, what they were talking about and how we were further along. So then they helped write sections of what became the Native American Agricultural Fund grant. They didn't write the whole thing because the grant writing group had another grant that they really wanted to work on. And they were like, and so everybody was kind of working on their own grants, but we had a couple of people who were like, I'll work on this one and I'll do sections. So I assigned them different sections and then they each wrote different sections to put into a draft. The class was over. The grant was actually due post the class. So then I went back later and put it all together. And we ended up getting the grant that year. So we got like $119,000 to put together some programs that we had developed as a class. And one of the biggest ones was an Indigenous Foods Festival. And so we hosted the first Indigenous Foods Festival last year, partially funded by the HIFE grant, and then also by the ongoing food summit that was happening on campus, and then also by the Native American Agricultural Fund grant. And this year we'll host a second year of the Indigenous Foods Festival funded by the Native American Agricultural Fund grant that students helped to write. And so then as part of the class this past like April, a student who was in the class came and said, remember I made you that video that was about the opening? And I said, yes. She said, I'll do one for you about the Foods Festival. She was very excited to like highlight the Foods Festival because it was a project that they envisioned and that they then wrote about. And then I turned in the grant later. And I'll say it's not like all the sections are perfect. Like student sections are informed by what they understand. It's that it just gives me a place to start. And sometimes when you're writing grants, you just need that place to start of like, what am I thinking about here? And so a lot of it is drafting and then me redrafting, but it is just very helpful to kind of start the process. So we did get the grant, hold the first festival. We're going to hold another one this year, spring of 2023, which will be the second annual Indigenous Foods Festival. But I wanted to give you a sense of one of the projects that we were able to get funded because of this work. So the last thing I'll say is if you're like, I can't offer like multiple grants because the idea of like managing, because what I do is like manage all the students, right? I did start in my very first class with just one singular grant that I had picked out that I was like, I really want to do this grant. And I'm going to have everybody in the class work on different sections of it, even if it's repeat. So for instance, this grant involved a logic model, which I don't love making logic models. And there was like 4 different groups that made a logic model in that class. And I got to sort of go through and say, okay, all of these things make sense, but I want to squish these things together. I want to do this. And then what came out of that was like a final logic model that we had done based on first their individual group like work and then as like a class. And we only focused on one grant that first semester, that we just all did parts of it. They might all write the introduction. They might all write the goals and objectives. It might be repetitive, but it helped me to kind of pick and choose what I thought was really powerful, or what's the language that actually made the most sense, and so I think that it was really helpful to be able to see all that come together. So I'll also say like just having the one grant that you want to apply for and having them write it over and over again is still helpful because you'll see that some people will have a very different view of like how to write about something that you might not have even thought of. And you'll be like, that's a really good wording. And I'll use that, right? And they got really excited about the collaborative nature of what that meant because they were like, each of us are writing sections, but we're all going to work together. I'll show you really quick. This was actually the logic model created by one of the students about the Food Sovereignty Lab, again, to like look like a house. And they were really thinking about like how they want it to be put together. It was very like well thought out. And then the students were able to come and say, oh, we should word this way. We should put this like this. So it was a lot of like consistent feedback that were offered. But that semester, I probably had like 6 logic models that were submitted and I was able to kind of go through and make them what they needed to be. Again, what I'll say is, what I found is that most students are really super excited to just know that they're doing something that might be turned in or might result in something. They get very like invested in like how they can help with that. They want to do more and more things. They will follow up and learn from people. So a lot of the times they'll be like, we want to do this. And I'll say, okay, we'll reach out to this person on campus. They'll have meetings with people. And now what we've been able to see is they continue to do that work. So when people ask me, there's a lot going on with the lab right now. They ask me like, how are you doing all of this? And then all the other things you have to do. It's really students. They check in with me. I'm the project like manager. I'm the director of the lab, but they are out there like doing step-by-step the work that they want to do. They feel very invested in how their campus can be a space for community and a space for people to sort of dream big things into being. So I would like highly encourage you to even just start the process of, maybe you want them each to write some type of 1-page document letter to a foundation, or maybe you want them to just have a conversation about something that is related to the class that you could talk about. If you even just let them into where you already are, I would sometimes come in and be like, I'm writing a grant about this. They would be like, can I help you? Can I write a part of that? They're very invested in sort of the work that you're doing. So I would highly encourage to let them in on what you're thinking about. I think I can end there in case people have like some questions, but I put all the resources in the chat, and I'll download and I can share the presentation here with you pretty quick. So.
There was a question in the chat from Renee. Do students ever express anxiety about grading on these assignments, and how do you handle that?
So the only way I grade this assignment is credit, no credit. It's either you turn something in and then you get credit for all the parts, or you don't turn anything in and then you don't get credit. I don't like, these assignments are actually not like, the part that they're getting the most feedback and kind of grade material is when we do the peer review, because those are rubrics that the peers are going through and actually giving really in detail feedback. The rest of it for me is credit, no credit. And we also, you'll see on, I think one of the assignments I gave you, the first semester when it was like a big group project, there was a group evaluation that each person had to fill out, where they evaluated themselves in how they worked with their group. And then they also could give an anonymous score to the other members of the group and their feedback about sort of like what had happened with group work. That just helped guide me in terms of where did people feel frustrated about the ways that groups were participating. But again, I had always said that the assignments were credit, no credit for me. And then if we were doing larger, big group projects, they would like assign points based on, they would say like, okay, I think completion of this section should be worth like 50 points in my grade. And I'd be like, cool, credit, 50 points, right? I think I took the pressure of like, it's a graded thing to, it's a thing you're gonna like leave behind. It's a thing you're gonna like say you contributed to. So. I just put the presentation into the chat too. If you want to download the presentation, it has the sort of the way that we break out the modules and things and some of the assignments that we do for each of them. You'll also see that many of those readings resources are included in the new grant writing course, because they're tested and tried and true for us. Like we've used them multiple semesters and they seem to do pretty good with students. So. Oh yeah, Susan. So there is, you can look at the Native American Studies YouTube page and you can see Carrie and Cody's second place student research competition presentation about the Food Sovereignty Lab project and the research that we did. And they go over start to finish. They even show you the results of the interviews and the coding process, and then how we came up with the idea and all kinds of stuff. If you want to see it, like see students talking about it. They did a whole presentation for the CSU research competition and then won second place.
Yes, and I really appreciate your help with your students. And Carrie entered the competition again and got second place. So
yeah, for her thesis research, yeah.
Yes, yes. So that's really great. Thanks for your support of the students.
So, I mean, that's it for me. It's 4 o'clock. I don't know if anybody else has any other questions or anything, but you've got resources if you need them. If you want to follow up, feel free. If you want me to come to a class and just talk about grant writing, I think I can also do that too. It was always really helpful just to hear people kind of break it down. And I have like my own little way of presenting it, trying to make it, I guess, like an interesting thing. I don't know. I really enjoy writing grants, but I'm a weirdo, so. I actually really enjoy writing grants. I like the writing of grants part.
All right, if nobody else has any questions, then I guess we'll end now, but please do join us at Septentrio if you have time. I'll make my way over there and find a spot, and I hope to see you there. Thank you, Katja, so much for your time and sharing all your experience and resources with us today.
Thanks everybody for listening.